When the First World War began, the Ottoman Empire was officially neutral. But from the very beginning of the war, the three pashas at the head of the empire's ruling dictatorship had made extensive plans to enter the war on the side of the Central Powers. They had made no secret of their love for Imperial Germany, and just 4 days into the conflict, signed a secret treaty promising to enter the war as Germany's ally. In retrospect, this is a difficult decision to make sense of, but from the Pasha's perspective, there were sensible reasons. Germany had been heavily involved in the modernization of the Ottoman Empire even before the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. And Germany's own invasion of Belgium demonstrated that neutrality was no guarantor of peace, especially not for a country that had lost 3 wars and huge amounts of territory in just the previous 4 years. Less understandable was the treatment that the ruling Committee of Union and Progress then directed against Greater Syria, which, while an integral part of the Ottoman state for 4 centuries, was in practice treated as an occupied territory, fit only for stationing troops, plundering resources, and extorting the locals. On the 1st of October, the 3 pashas abolished all foreign concessions in the empire, declared martial law in Palestine, and banned the use of Hebrew. Upon entry into the war later that month, 50,000 Jews in Palestine, being non-citizens born in the Russian Empire, were automatically classified as enemy aliens and scheduled for deportation or internment. For a brief moment, U.S. Ambassador Henry Morgenthau Sr. convinced the Ottoman government to give these Jewish aliens a window of several months to obtain Ottoman citizenship. But it was all for naught, as on the 18th of November, Navy Minister Ahmed Jamal Pasha was placed at the head of the Fourth Army. Already well known for his anti-Semitic and generally Turkish supremacist views, he had the entire Jewish population searched, disarmed, and placed under financial sanction, and ordered mass conscription of Ottoman Jewish citizens to serve as forced labor and to relinquish any cash they had on hand. On the 17th of December, Jamal Pasha reneged on the agreement with Morgenthau and ordered the arrest and deportation of Jewish non-citizens effective immediately, either to Egypt on neutral Italian and American ships or to internment camps in Anatolia. This was even applied to some Jewish citizens of countries allied with the Ottomans, such as the Zionist organization's German-born Palestine office chief Artur Rupin. And while the Pasha justified all of these measures as being anti-Zionist rather than anti-Semitic, the measures against Hebrew, which had been in common use in parts of the region for centuries, the fact that many Zionist leaders in Palestine had vocally supported the Ottoman cause, and the indiscriminate conscription of naturalized Jewish citizens into forced labor betrayed his true intentions. By mid-1915, Jamal Pasha had expelled nearly a quarter of Palestine's Jewish population. But for the moment, there were limits on how much terror he could inflict. Palestine wasn't exactly well known for having a large ethnic Turkish population, which left the Pasha almost entirely dependent on the locals he so disdained. Just 2 weeks into the war, Sultan Mehmed V declared the war to be a jihad and banned non-Muslims from serving in combat roles in the Ottoman army. Yet many Palestinian Jews continued to serve. And though almost all of these men served in support roles, at least 2 of them didn't. Lieutenant Colonel Ben Karmi Eisenberg, the empire's highest-ranking Jewish officer, served on the front lines of the Caucasus Front before being captured. And much as we might ridicule David Ben-Gurion and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi for trying to raise a pro-Ottoman Jewish force even after being expelled from the empire, their colleague Moshe Sharet somehow worked his way up to a position in 4th Army headquarters under Jamal Pasha himself. But above anyone else, there was one Jew in Palestine on which the Pasha depended most, and it was he who would help seal the fate of the empire. Aharon Aharonson was probably the most famous man in Palestine before the war. Born in Romania, as a child his family settled in the village that would eventually become known as Zichron Yaakov. Trained as an agronomist in France and self-taught as a geologist, Aharonson skyrocketed to fame in 1906 through his rediscovery of emmer, the ancestor of most modern strains of wheat, growing wild on the slopes of Mount Hermon in the Galilee, which lent credence to the theory that agriculture had first emerged in West Asia and inspired hope for the cultivation of new drought and famine-resistant wheat varieties. Over the next several years, Aharonson toured Europe and the United States and was even offered a professorship at the University of California. Instead, he used the opportunity to redouble support for the Zionist cause among American Jews, examined California agriculture as a model for the similar climate in Palestine, and secured a fellowship with the U.S. Department of Agriculture for an experimental farm in Atlit, not far from his hometown of Zichron, and co-managed by Avshalom Feinberg, his assistant and later his sister Rivka's fiancé. In these efforts, Aharonson was no stranger to controversy. For all his efforts to support Jewish causes, financier Jacob Schiff was vehemently opposed to Zionism and supported Aharonson's project only reluctantly for its humanitarian value. Unbeknownst to Schiff, the Aharonson family was far more unpopular among the Zionist movement in Palestine itself due to their employment of Arab farm workers. This was the time of the Second Aliyah, when Zionism became overwhelmingly dominated by socialist parties which denounced the employment of Arab workers as a perpetuation of the same economic conditions that had relegated Jews to the urban proletariat and bourgeoisie in Europe. In their eyes, nothing was more important than working the land yourself. But Aharonson retorted that the Felachin had insights into local methods of farming that were essential to truly understanding the land. Aharonson's fame, expertise, Ottoman citizenship, and alienation from the broader Zionist movement were crucial to insulating his family from the Ottomans' wrath when the war broke out. The Fourth Army had been quick to loot the farms of Palestine for their crops, machinery, and even irrigation pipes. Now they were running out of food and needed someone who knew how to produce more. Following a requisite bribe from Aharonson's youngest brother Alex, Jamal Pasha invited the renowned scientist for a series of meetings that he hoped would extract some assistance from Aharonson's patrons in the U.S. The Pasha was furious at having to ask a Jew for help, and Aharonson knew it. But any intransigence between the two men came to an end in March 1915. While the Fourth Army pushed into the Sinai in a vain effort to capture the Suez Canal, their already dwindling food supply in Palestine was wiped out by a plague of locusts. Jamal Pasha immediately called on Aharonson, who, despite not being an expert on the problem, swiftly mobilized Feinberg and 50 volunteers to fight the infestation. But despite their best intentions, Aharonson and Feinberg were unable to convince Ottoman officials or even local farmers that this was an issue worth fixing, and Jamal Pasha did nothing to vouch for them. In any case, Aharonson and Feinberg abandoned the project in late April. Their travels around the region had alerted them to a horror far greater than locusts.
On the second day of our journey, we saw a corpse flowing in the Euphrates. We were surprised, but the soldier accompanying us reassured us that this was a body of an Armenian. We found out that there was a camp nearby on the other side of the Euphrates where Armenians deported from Armenia were being held. Our French Huronian turned white and asked us to cross the Euphrates and go to the Armenian camp.
During their effort to eradicate the locusts, Jamal Pasha had lent Aharonson and Feinberg his best translator, a Jewish lieutenant named Etan Belkind, who by coincidence happened to be Feinberg's cousin. When the Locust Project failed, Belkind was recalled to Damascus and redeployed to Mesopotamia. There, he first uncovered the horrors of the Armenian genocide. This is a topic which is too large and, frankly, too sensitive for me to address comprehensively in this video. Suffice it to say that local and state-sponsored violence against Christian groups in Anatolia, particularly Armenians, had been fairly common since the 1870s. In these more remote areas of the empire, Armenians tended to be more educated and upwardly mobile than their Turkish neighbors. And when Russia asserted its position as the defender of Armenians in various conflicts, Ottoman leaders before and after the Young Turk Revolution saw it as evidence of Armenian treachery. When the war broke out, jihad was declared and non-Muslims were conscripted into forced labor, some Armenian leaders in the city of Van rebelled, a self-fulfilling prophecy that the three pashas used to justify atrocities on a scale not seen before in the modern era. Across Anatolia and northern Syria, millions of Christians, mainly Armenians, were rounded up and interned in camps, either to be exterminated on the spot or sent on death marches into the Syrian desert.
At night before departure, we heard terrible, heart-rending female screams. The Armenian camp was 1 kilometer away from our house. The screaming continued all night. We asked what was happening, and they told us that children were being taken from their mothers to live in dormitories and continue their education. However, in the morning, when we set off and crossed the bridge across the Euphrates, I was shocked to see the river red with blood and beheaded corpses of children floating on the water.
Plans for the genocide had gone into effect the same day Belkin was recalled from the Locust Project. As a non-Muslim support officer, Lieutenant Belkin traveled with soldiers who were themselves Armenian and soon found themselves in mortal danger. Even Belkin was nearly condemned to death due to his name Etan, which in the pre-revolutionary Turkish alphabet was spelled similarly to the Armenian name Etyan.
The Circassian soldiers ordered the Armenians to gather dry grass and pile it into a tall pyramid. Then they tied up all the Armenians who were there, almost 5,000 souls, their hands tied together, and put them in a circle around the pile of grass and set it afire in a blaze, which rose up to the heaven together with the screams of the wretched people who were being burned to death. I fled from the place. I could not stand this horrifying sight. I rode as fast as I could, wishing to get as far from the place as possible. After 2 hours of crazy gallop, I could still hear screams of the poor victims until they died out. In 2 days, I returned to that place and saw the burned bodies of thousands of people.
As soon as Belkin returned to Damascus, he wrote down as much as he could remember from the tour and handed his writings over to his cousin Yosef Lishansky, who promptly returned to Palestine, alerting his brother Naaman Belkin and the Aharonson family. While Belkin's words opened many eyes to the scale of the genocide, its effects had been felt in Palestine from the very beginning, though not in quite the same way as elsewhere. Though a willing participant in the exterminations in northern Syria, Jamal Pasha seemed content to forcibly convert and assimilate those who fled into Lebanon and Palestine, where a great many of them died of starvation and exposure in labor camps. His reasons for doing so are murky, but the Jewish community was no less spooked. And given the Pasha's ongoing efforts against the Jewish community, the implication was clear. We're next. For far too many leaders in the Yishuv, the response was fearful silence. The Aharonsons were not among them. Aharon Aharonson had long concluded from Jamal Pasha's cruelty to the locals, his indifference to the challenges of feeding his army, and the lack of discipline among his troops, that the days of Ottoman rule in Palestine were numbered. Much as it pained him to turn against the country where he'd grown up and to which he'd always pledged allegiance, the time had come to reach out to the Allies. But this was easier said than done. In July 1915, the youngest Aharonson siblings, Alex and Rivka, voluntarily evacuated to Egypt on the USS Des Moines, hoping to persuade the local British military leadership with intel Aharon had managed to collect during his campaign against the Locusts. The Palestinian coast, he discovered, was virtually defenseless, and the terrain around Atlit could hardly be better suited for an amphibious landing. The British flatly ignored their intel, and the siblings departed Egypt for the United States. But Aharon had prepared for this. Just 3 days after Alex and Rivka's departure from Alexandria, Avshalom Feinberg arrived in the city, making the same offer with the same information. This time, he found sympathy from the archaeologist and naval intelligence officer Leonard Woolley, who accepted the offer and had Feinberg discreetly dropped off the coast of Atlit that November. Alas, this effort was no more successful. Besieged by logistical problems and incompetent local messengers, Woolley grew impatient and abandoned Feinberg. He was captured by the Ottomans during a reconnaissance mission the following year. In desperation, Feinberg attempted to reconnect with the British by walking to Egypt, but was caught by Ottoman soldiers in no man's land and held for trial in Beersheba. Yosef Lishansky and Naaman Belkin were able to get the charges dropped through some hefty bribes, but Feinberg was forced to keep a low profile. During Feinberg's misadventures in the south, eldest sister Sarah Aharonson had returned to Palestine, escaping a loveless marriage in Constantinople. Like Etan Belkin before her, she had much to report about what she'd seen on her journey. By foot and by train, she had taken 3 weeks to reach Haifa, passing deserted Armenian villages, corpses piled high along the railroad tracks, not even attempting to hide them. Frequently, the trains she rode were stopped by soldiers searching for yet more Armenians, who when found were removed and summarily executed in view of the other passengers. Only after arriving in Haifa did she learn of the restrictions Jamal Pasha had instituted against Jews. She needed no persuading to join the family's latest enterprise. Jamal Pasha, meanwhile, in his efforts to lure Aharon back into assisting with wartime food production, had invited him to Damascus for a 3-week tour of Ottoman military facilities.
Yes. No! You knobheads!
Following that indispensable piece of military intelligence, Aharon spent several months collecting new intel on Palestine's coastal defenses before mounting his own, far more ambitious journey to finally gain the attention and trust of the British. In July, he departed for Europe, spending a month each in Constantinople, Berlin, and Copenhagen. In Berlin, he met with Otto Warburg, fellow scientist and president of the Zionist organization now based in Germany. His time with Warburg took a great emotional toll. He was a lifelong mentor and friend. He was also an irreproachable German patriot, and Aharonson dare not reveal his true intentions. All he required from Warburg was permission to cross the border into neutral Denmark, where he discovered to his horror that his youngest brother Alex had busied himself in America writing a scathing pair of articles about Ottoman atrocities in the magazine Atlantic Monthly. Incensed, Aharon wrote to his brother to cease making such public statements, lest they attract the suspicions of Jamal Pasha. Miraculously, they never did. In Denmark, Aharonson also revealed himself as a natural-born spy. Upon arrival, he sent out a flurry of messages to Zionist activists in the United States announcing his intention to visit and booked passage on a steamship to New York. However, that steamship had a stopover in Kirkwall, Scotland, and this gave Aharonson the perfect opportunity. In short order, he managed to arrange a meeting with British Ambassador Sir Ralph Paget, to whom he made 2 requests. First, he wanted a written guarantee from the Foreign Office that British authorities wouldn't arrest him as an enemy agent during the stopover in Kirkwall. This should have gone without saying. As a neutral vessel of the Scandinavian-American line, Britain would normally refrain from inspecting the ship or molesting any passengers bearing enemy citizenship. But this belied Aharonson's second request, that British police violate that promise and arrest him. Only then could he get to London, convince the British of his sincerity in the Allied cause, and present them with the intel that he had so diligently collected. 6 days later, British police in Kirkwall boarded the SS Oscar II, found Aharonson, and with great fanfare, arrested him as an Ottoman agent. At Whitehall, Aharonson and his intelligence report were greeted with unexpected warmth. Change was in the air. The intransigent Lord Kitchener was dead, and the cabinet was undergoing a complete reshuffle. The Arabs of Hejaz were in open revolt, led by Prince Faisal and aided by British Captain Thomas Edward Lawrence. Captain Trumpeldor, Aharonson learned, had brought what remained of the Zion Mule Corps to France, manning anti-air defenses at the infamous Battle of the Somme, while Colonel Patterson and Jabotinsky made plans for the creation of an entire Jewish regiment. At the War Office, Aharonson found an eager ally in Major Walter Gribben, who was key to winning over the sympathies of MP and diplomat Sir Mark Sykes. Just a few months earlier, Sykes had arranged a secret agreement with France to partition Greater Syria, including Palestine, into a series of colonies and spheres of influence, despite previous British assurances to support an independent Arab federation. An avowed anti-Semite, Sykes was just as indifferent to the Zionist cause as to that of the Arab nationalists, but with the right prodding from Gribben, Sykes at least became more open to the military implications of Aharonson's intel report. The coast of Palestine was protected by no more than 400 regulars, reserves, coast guards, and local mujahideen, spread across 13 improvised bases and observation posts, any one of which could be taken down by a single British company, if not bypassed entirely. The report was as magnificent as it was irrelevant. At the time, Britain was reeling from the failure of the Gallipoli campaign, as well as the catastrophic defeat at Kut al-Amara in Mesopotamia. The thought of another amphibious landing, or of once again underestimating the Ottomans, haunted the War Office. For the moment, the dream of dismantling the Ottoman Empire had faded. Even Sykes' imperialist plans seemed improbable. Instead, the British effort in West Asia became strictly defensive. Even the Arab revolt in Hejaz was supported primarily for its propaganda value. But that would soon change. As the year drew to a close, the newly reorganized British government became more receptive to a new offensive in Palestine, and accordingly made arrangements to send Aharonson to Port Said. What happened there was kind of a repeat of the events in London. Aharonson quickly found allies in the pro-Arab intelligence officer Gertrude Bell and MP William Ormsby Gore, a fanatical opponent of Sykes, who not only called for Arab and Jewish self-determination, but opposed the very idea of the British Empire. And while they struggled to convince many others of Aharonson's invasion proposal, the Egyptian general headquarters saw no trouble in using him to collect new intel just in case. Throughout January 1917, the Royal Navy made several attempts to land Aharonson off the coast, but were repeatedly stymied by winter storms. This turned out to have deadly consequences. Following one such attempt, Aharonson was shocked to hear that Yosef Lishansky had turned up in Port Said, recovering from multiple bullet wounds. Aharonson rushed to find his friend and learn what had happened. After failing to receive Aharon's correspondence, Avshalom Feinberg had correctly guessed that he was in Egypt, and with Lishansky endeavored to cross the Sinai in order to find him. On the 20th of January, the two men were ambushed outside Rafah by a group of Bedouin led by Ottoman soldiers. Feinberg was killed on the spot, but Lishansky, wounded and left to die in the desert, was miraculously found by an Australian cavalry patrol. The Allies had taken their first step into Palestine. With Aharonson scheduled to make another landing attempt, Lishansky gave him Feinberg's Bible. Aharonson dare not mourn his friend in public, lest news of the tragedy reach Jamal Pasha and expose the operation. Finally, on the 29th, Aharonson and the British successfully landed off Atlit and re-established contact. A month later, Aharonson returned to Palestine and picked up fellow operative Levi Schneerson. Still mourning the loss of their friend, Aharonson and Schneerson opened Feinberg's Bible to a random passage in the Book of Samuel. In this chapter, the prophet Shmuel has informed King Shaul that he has lost favor with God, who has chosen a new king to take over the land. Shaul, we are told, will not get a second chance, for the glory of Israel does not deceive, or in Hebrew, Netzach Yisrael lo yeshaker. Aharon, Schneerson exclaimed, I found the name in the Bible. By the winter of 1917, the War Office had judged that Aharon Aharonson was too valuable to be allowed to return to Palestine and risk capture, instead putting him to work directly under the general headquarters of the newly formed Egyptian Expeditionary Force. In his absence, eldest sister Sarah took the lead role behind the Ottoman line. In the 7 months since Aharon's departure, the revolt in Hejaz had turned Jamal Pasha against the local Arab population, earning him the nickname the Serial Killer and drawing many of the Aharonson's Arab workers into the operation. Sarah then created Jewish and Arab networks to collect intel on ports, railroads, local water supplies, Ottoman casualties, and the growing influx of German reinforcements. Their movements in the south were tracked by Naaman Belkind, while his brother Eitan recruited military informants in Damascus and scouted out targets for aerial bombing. In March, GHQ redeployed Yosef Lishansky to Atlit with several £100 worth of French francs to pay Neely's workers and distribute aid to the now penniless Yishuv. He also brought Sarah several crates of homing pigeons. Atlit was only 500 kilometers from Port Said, and if the German Navy ever decided to deploy U-boats to the region, these would be the sole form of communication. With Lishansky as her chaperone, Sarah was able to tour the full extent of Neely operations, from Damascus to Jerusalem, sending back a full account of Ottoman and German troop numbers, artillery, machine guns, motor vehicles, rifles, ammunition depots, and aircraft, finding plenty of soldiers but very little equipment, as well as gossip among the German officers and rising discontent among the local population. GHQ's new intelligence chief Richard Meinertzhagen couldn't have been more thrilled. Following the success of their latest offensive in Mesopotamia, The British were now ready to break the Palestine front wide open with a swift, decisive victory at Gaza. But of course, this was 1917. The age of singular tactical victories was long over, and despite General Archibald Murray's claim of victory, the city embarrassingly remained in Ottoman hands. But if Murray was trapped in antiquated notions of military strategy, so was Jamal Pasha. Through the attempt to encircle Gaza, he realized that the British must have known that his forces were gathering there, and once again turned his attention to the Jews and Arabs. 2 days after the battle, the Pasha sent a dispatch to Jaffa announcing that all residents of the city and surrounding area would have to evacuate effective the 9th of April. Only agricultural workers would be exempt. Furthermore, he forbade deportees from taking refuge anywhere else in the Mutasarrafate of Jerusalem or in major port cities like Haifa. Those with enough money to bribe him would be allowed to take refuge in the countryside further north. But all others, he assured, would be accommodated at camps he had established in northern Syria. Immediately, Sarah Aharonson and Naaman Belkin sent news of the evacuation to GHQ, which Allied media eagerly exaggerated for propaganda purposes, much as they had with similar events in Europe, muddying the historical record ever since and tragically undercutting the seriousness of what actually happened. While some outlets of the time claimed that the order only applied to Jews, or even that there was an accompanying massacre of Jews, this wasn't the case. In fact, only about half of deportees were Jewish. A month earlier, Jamal Pasha had ordered the evacuation of Gaza, and it had gone largely unnoticed. On the other hand, the Pasha was no less bigoted towards Arabs than towards Jews, with a body count to prove it. The German government certainly feared the worst. German diplomats and military advisors, including Field Marshal Erich von Falkenhayn, began interceding with the Pasha to rescind his internment plan in fear for their own Jewish citizens in the region. Even Grand Vizier Mehmed Talat Pasha demanded, without success, that all deportees be allowed to return home. But realistically, any plan to liquidate the Jews and Arabs of maritime Judea was impracticable. By the spring of 1917, Ottoman authority in Palestine had almost totally collapsed. Some wealthy Tel Avivis did take refuge in Jerusalem and Haifa and suffered no consequences. Smaller villages like Zichron Yaakov doubled in population overnight, with Meir Dizengoff calmly organizing a resettlement committee in Petach Tikva just outside Tel Aviv. Unless there was a significant military presence nearby, you could pretty much do anything, and everyone did. A week after the deportation of Jaffa, Sarah, Lishansky, and Schneerson evacuated to Egypt, with middle brother Tzvi Aharonson taking over in Zichron. Sarah received a hero's welcome among the top brass of the EEF, the daring heroine of the Palestine front. His clout newly burnished by the arrival of his sister, Aharon proposed an amphibious assault on Atlit to General Murray. But Murray, again burned by memories of Gallipoli, refused. Aharon then proposed a flanking attack on Beersheba, which Murray rejected as impractical. By all accounts, Murray was an exceptionally nice guy, but like seemingly most generals of the First World War, he was overcautious and unimaginative. Finally, at the end of June, Murray was recalled as commander of the EEF. His replacement, General Edmund Allenby, was not so cautious, and his first act upon arrival was to consult Aharonson. By this time, the United States had entered the war, and though they specifically avoided declaring war on the Ottoman Empire, their involvement forced Germany to begin withdrawing their forces in Palestine for redeployment in Europe. And on the 6th of July, Captain Lawrence and the Arabs of Hejaz converged with the British at Aqaba, providing Allenby with the perfect opportunity to distract, divide, and overpower the Turkish defenses. By this time, Sarah and Lishansky had returned to Zichron. In their absence, the Turks had narrowed their search for spies to the Jewish community on the plains south of Haifa. The village fathers had caught wind of Sarah's activities and demanded that Neely be shut down lest they all pay the price. Part of the problem was that the British, French, and Arabs were simultaneously running their own spy rings in the region, which were far less effective at covering their tracks and only aroused more suspicion around the Yishuv. Accordingly, Ottoman patrols of rural Palestine increased, tightening the noose around the Aharonson farm. Nevertheless, Neely's activity only increased. General Allenby had been clear. Jerusalem by Christmas. Allenby's plan was as such. While it was imperative that the Ottomans continue to expect another attack at Gaza, a British, Australian, and New Zealand force would instead take Beersheba, using overwhelming numbers but still favoring speed and surprise over firepower. Beersheba was home to a huge number of underground reservoirs with which the British could re-establish a functioning water supply, essential to the large cavalry, light horse, and horse-drawn artillery units necessary for the next phase of fighting in Palestine. Captain Lawrence, recently returned from the capture of Aqaba, was horrified to discover that Aharonson had also been lobbying Allenby for British concessions in favor of Jewish self-determination in Palestine. Though GHQ tended not to take Lawrence very seriously due to his tendency to exaggerate his own role in the Arab revolt. In contrast to Bell, who had become a close ally of Aharonson, Lawrence made an absolutely terrible impression, coming across as a megalomaniac and racist. The accuracy of these impressions is uncertain, but as we shall see after the war, the overlap between Jewish and Arab nationalist interests in 1917 wasn't actually the existential turning point that later events would suggest. In any case, Aharonson was soon recalled to London, leaving Sarah as the uncontested leader of Neely. Using information she'd provided, British bombers were able to destroy Ottoman earthworks and artillery positions. They were able to provide Allenby with complete orders of battle and even the names of every commanding officer. But Lishansky's involvement was becoming more and more of a liability. He'd long had a reputation as an untrustworthy narcissist who was quick to violence and had made lots of enemies in the Yishuv prior to the war. Sarah's brother Tzvi even suspected Lishansky of murdering Avshalom Feinberg, mistaking Aharon's discretion over Feinberg's death as a cover-up for Lishansky rather than an effort to conceal Neely itself. As the British continued to stall in the south, calls to disband the organization rang louder and louder from the town leaders in Zichron. But it was GHQ's negligence that really exposed Neely. Throughout 1917, GHQ had been funding Neely using French francs, which were commonly used in the Ottoman Empire, and had been careful to only provide coins minted before the outbreak of war. But since Aharon's departure to London, they had started sending newer coins, which quickly filtered out into the general population and attracted the suspicions of the Ottoman military. Operatives in Palestine's other spy rings had recently been caught and tortured into claiming the existence of a Jewish ring somewhere between Haifa and Caesarea. U-boat activity increased off the coast, and Neely carrier pigeons began to be intercepted by Turkish officers. And in September, Naaman Belkin was caught trying to flip a disgruntled Ottoman officer, tortured, and sent to Damascus to await execution. GHQ urged Sarah Aharonson to evacuate, but she refused, and soon it was too late. By the end of September, mass arrests began. Lishansky went into hiding. On the 30th of September, during the holiday of Sukkot, Sarah destroyed all documents and messages and returned to Zichron Yaakov, only to find the town deserted on what was supposed to be a holiday celebration. After dark, soldiers arrived to arrest her. Her remaining family and many other villagers had been taken as hostages and tortured for information. Though the Ottoman army and police had readily used torture for decades, it had actually been illegal since the mid-19th century due to its tendency to produce false confessions. Because of this, the Ottomans revealed to Sarah that they had gleaned huge amounts of incorrect information about Neely, like the notion that her father Ephraim had been the leader. Sarah took sole responsibility as the spy. Unsatisfied, the Ottomans called in the renowned torturer Osman Bey of Haifa, who, in violation of the taboo against striking a woman who wasn't your wife, engaged in 3 days of very creative physical and sexual tortures that I don't really want to say on YouTube. After 5 days, however, Osman Bey gave up. Sarah, defiant, declared that they had failed and would continue to fail until the empire was no more. The authorities then ordered her to be taken to Damascus for execution. But knowing their complicated attitudes towards women, Osman Bey notwithstanding, she asked to be allowed to return home in order to clean herself and change clothes. Once left alone in the bathroom, she took a loaded pistol out of the cabinet and shot herself. She had missed, and for 3 days bled out, fading in and out of consciousness. Zichron Yaakov's doctor, Hillel Yaffe, was brought in to save her so that the Ottomans could still execute her. She requested that Yaffe assist her passing, but Yaffe refused for fear of the Ottomans. Instead, she lingered, and on the morning of the 9th of October, she awoke once more, gave her final goodbyes, and faded away. She was 27 years old. With her, too, went Neely. The hunt for Lishansky continued, with even the Zionist paramilitary Hashomer joining forces with the Ottomans to find him. A few days later, he was caught stealing a camel in the effort to cross the British line, after which he was sent north and tortured into giving away other members of Neely. He and Naaman Belkin were hanged in the public square in Damascus on the 16th of December, 1917. But by this time, it was too late. Neely, though shattered, had succeeded. The British had triumphed at Beersheba, and Allenby, true to his word, had taken Jerusalem by Christmas. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Matthew Feinberg, Jay Fleischman, Osher Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Jacob Kossoff, Eric Liederman, Jeffrey Schweitzer, and Ian York.